tile fishing. I'm Alan Lee, have Musician Sport Fishing, as Jim mentioned. It's a 44-foot Henriques fly bridge. We usually are based in Manasquan. We usually start our season second week of April or so. We go up to Keyport, Raritan Bay, New Jersey for the striper fishing. We do that for about a month. We come back to Manasquan mid-May-ish or so. We do a little bit of sea bassing, some more striper fishing. And then usually from about first week of June until the end of September, we're tuna fishing, which in parentheses oftentimes means we're tile fishing too. You know, it's interesting that back in the day, tile fishing used to be sort of like the incidental catch. It used to be what we did when tuna fishing was not good, or we tuna fished in the morning. It's got to be about 9 or 10 in the morning, and the tuna bite sort of slowed down. So what would we do, because we were going to stay out in the canyons until the evening bite for tuna. So we had from that 9 o'clock until 9 a.m. to about 3 p.m. time slot where we were like, what are we going to do? And, you know, back in the day when you could fish for makos legally, sometimes we'd fish for makos out there, or we would do this. We'd do tile fishing. So, you know, it's interesting though. Over the years, tile fishing has really evolved in a good way to, you know, being a sport in and of itself. So in other words, the point here being, you know, whereas we used to tile fish when we didn't have anything else to do, or it was part of a tuna trip, there are a lot of dedicated trips now for tiles. A lot of it became popularized. Whoops, this is gonna let's do this. A lot of it got popularized by a couple of really key people. Unfortunately, both of them are not with us anymore. One is, some of you might remember Dave Beatman. He had a tackle shop in Brielle called the Real Seat. And Dave was a real hardcore angler in many respects, but he really loved tile fishing, and he helped popularize it. And the other really big name, and there are many, but I mean, one of the other big names was Jeff Gutman, who ran the party boat Voyager, which right down the street from where you fish a lot. And you know, unfortunately, Jeff's passed also, but Jeff helped to really put tile fishing on the map as a sport in and of itself. So you guys in here tile fished before? Folks in here tile fished before? Okay, great. Okay, and you're running your own boat, or you're jumping on someone else's boat? Some boat. All right. Okay. So why don't we spend some time? You know, and certainly it's a small enough group. We could just chat. You know. It doesn't have to be anything formal and things like that. But, you know, I think today I'll try to cover some, both in terms of finding tiles as a boat owner / operator, where to find them, where to target them. And we'll also talk about some of the angling techniques too, in case you don't have to run your own boat. You just sort of end up over where tile fish are, okay? So when we talk about tiles, you know, we have two general species of tile fish off of our coast, off the East Coast, in fact, but especially like New Jersey, Delaware. Talk about goldens or blue lines, and they're both bottom fish, as you know. They tend to be in slightly different areas, although there are areas where they commingle. And you know, it's interesting. Probably 40 years ago, when I first started to get into hardcore tile fishing, they lived in very separate areas. But in more recent decades, it seems that the goldens and the blue lines commingle, meaning they're living in the same areas more and more. I'm talking with some of the other Sharpies that do this. We don't really know if it's a matter of like environmental changes or just that we're looking in different areas. But you know, you can find them together, but more often than not, they are in sort of some different areas. A couple of pointers to just bring up before we really get into some of the tile fishing techniques. Keep in mind there are bag limits on goldens and blue lines. And not only are there bag limits, but depending on whether you're a recreational boat owner or you're fishing on a charter or head boat, your limits are different, okay? So obviously pay attention to what they are. Blue lines generally also have a season. It's usually around May 1st before it opens up. You don't want to be that person that goes out on April 26th because it's an absolutely beautiful flat day. You run, 60 miles out of Cape May or whatever, get some really great blue line tile fishing, and you post it online, and then your buddies call you up and say, hey, blue line season doesn't open until May 1st. So just double check when, especially the blue line season opens. Goldens are open year-round usually, or historically they've always been open year-round. Even if you're a private recreational fishing boat, there is a permit. Good news is it's free. Bad news is it's another level of reporting or permit holding that you have to obtain from NOAA. It's been in place for a few years now. A lot of folks either didn't know about it or did not adhere to it. Anecdotally, I know a lot of people have been getting dinged for meaning caught for not having a recreational tile fish permit. But if you're running your own boat, you think you're going to tile fish, if you frequent the canyons for tuna and you think there might be an off day that you might tile fish, I'm going to say to you, spend the $0, and because it is free, just get the permit, have it on there. But basically, tile fishing is going to be deep water, usually at a minimum about 325 to maybe 1,200 feet of water. There's pros and cons with shallow versus deeper water. We'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the nice things is that, especially with some of the advances in tackle, we see a lot more of this fishing being a lighter tackle jig fishing, and it can be a lot of fun because, historically, as a charter owner operator, when I'm booking trips and I'm having those early conversations with charters and I bring up tile fishing, I can't tell you how many times people sort of like groan. They're like, oh, I don't want to be cranking something up, 700-800 feet, or they might say, I don't want to be fishing with electric reels. And you hear all these complaints about tile fishing because the sort of historic thought was that it takes a lot to get these fish up from the bottom. And I'm going to say that is not true anymore. Okay, so current tile fishing, I can only tell you, is it's not your grandfather's tile fishing anymore. There's a lot of tackle advances, advances in terms of braided lines, reels, rods, things like that really make it a lot of fun. I also pro staff for Shimano, I try to be up on emerging trends in tackle and things like that. Also sort of a disclaimer that a lot of what I talk about in terms of tackle, rods and reels, is going to be sort of Shimano oriented. But in all fairness, other tackle manufacturers, there's other companies out there that do this stuff. And and many of you have done this already, tiles are incredibly tasty fish, okay? We just, can't get over how good they taste. This is a couple of boxes. These are, I think, 178 quart coolers. This was a trip, I think we were coming back from Wilmington Canyon probably a year or two ago. And in fact, I think the only reason that these fish are out and not on ice right now is we oftentimes spend if we're coming back from Wilmington back to Manasquan, it's usually about a 4-hour run. And if it's pretty flat out, we actually do our tile fish cutting at sea because we can legally cut these at sea. But nice box of blue lines and goldens. Okay. Some little facts and tidbits about goldens. You can see a really good picture of what a golden looks like. Really cool fish, right? When you look at them, it's just got some really cool colors in them. Goldens are generally known to live anywhere from about 250 feet to about 1,000 feet. I would tell you that general fact and figure about 250 feet, it's not really ring true for fishing off of New Jersey or Delaware. Why is that? Because for us, and you all know this already, if you run out in New Jersey or Delaware, 250 feet of water is depth is usually just sort of flat sand. And for us in New Jersey, most of it's going to be closer to the edge of the canyon. So it's going to be usually more around 450, 600 feet of water for our part of the country before we find goldens. had a chance to look at some sort of underwater submarine footage. Goldens and blue lines also, they live in what are called colonies. So there's like little burrows that they build, and they live in there. And the cool thing about the burrows is that you can find them. People are always asking about how to find where good tilefish grounds are. But these burrows are usually about a foot and a half in height. So if this floor is the canyon floor, these burrows are usually about a foot and a half off. So if you're if you're running your own boat and you're the one looking at the color scope, your fish finder, as you're going over some areas where you think they might be holding, one of the things, if you set your fish finder on, let's say, bottom zoom, all right, and you get a better enlarged view of the bottom, what you'll see with tilefish grounds is, good tilefish grounds, is that the bottom sort of comes up like little burrows, okay? And the best way I could describe it is if you have a hacksaw blade, picture a hacksaw blade upside down, so the teeth are facing up. That's what it looks like on a bottom zoomed fish finder. It looks like little saw teeth of a hacksaw. We usually find tilefish colonies are built on the deepest, on the sharpest slope of the canyon walls. And how do we know it's the sharpest slope? If you look at your chart plotter, your maps, and you have the bathymetric lines, the tighter lines are generally where it's a sharper drop. So we usually start our looking there. Our Goldens generally range anywhere from about 5 to 35 pounds. There's some in the 50s and the 60s. Those are like the great granddaddies and grandmothers. We like to get them. They tend to be more difficult to find. We were talking before a little bit about the depth of where to go. Oftentimes some of your deeper water spots do hold the bigger fish because they get hit less often than shallow water spots. If we have a trip, for example, where we know someone's interested in targeting a potentially record fish, we tend to fish more like the 800 to 900 foot depths than your 400 to 500s, because there's a lot more, activity in the 400 or 500. Not a lot more fishing activity that happens in 400 or 500 feet. So they tend to get depleted a little bit more. So blue lines tend to be a little bit smaller. They usually, most of what you can catch is around the 5 pound mark up to about 18, 20 pounds. Sometimes they're 24, 25, which is a really nice one. Mentioned this is Dave DeGennaro, who's actually the gentleman who he and his family run this show. And you can see the coloration of the blue lines a little bit different. Oftentimes there's never-ending discussions as to what tastes better, blue lines or Goldens. I think it's a personal preference thing. They're both good. To me, Goldens tend to be more sort of like lobster tail-like, that sort of like rubbery kind of thing. Whereas to me, blue lines tend to be like a little bit drier, but they're still both great eating fish. One of the things about blue lines, they tend to live in a near rocky or harder bottom more than Goldens. But the really good news is that in our area, you tend to find blue lines a little bit shallower. So even if it's about 325, 350, we often come across some really nice colonies of blue lines, the edge of the Wilmington Canyons, edge of the Baltimore, down that way, Poor Man's. Blue lines, the sort of the uppermost limit of where we usually find them is around the Hudson Canyon. The canyons that are north of the Hudson, areas near like the Dip, usually don't hold many blue lines. Usually from, if you look at sort of latitude, it's sort of, Hudson on south through the Virginia canyons and things like that. All right. So now we have a general idea of where to look, what to look for in terms of, where they might be living. Any questions on that so far? Sort of the where to look? Okay. All right. So there's probably there are two general ways that we could fish for them. More traditional bait fishing, or jigging. So let's get into the bait fishing side of it first, and then we'll talk a little bit later about jigging, which has really become very popular, and it's something I would really encourage you guys to try. As really, you know, in the last couple of years that I've been doing the tile fish seminar, because I think 10 years ago no one really wanted to hear about tile fishing, but in the last couple of years I do the tile fish seminar. One of the coolest things for me, it's a great feeling to hear people come up to our booth or whatever and say, hey, you know, I tried that tile fish jigging last year, and it was like the coolest thing. But let's talk about bait fishing as sort of our tried and true way of doing it. Tackle wise, we're almost always talking about conventional gear as opposed to spinning gear, because you know, we're usually dropping, again, 300-400 feet. Most of the rods that we tend to use, again, when we're dropping for tile fish, it could be 400 feet, it could be 900 feet. We are talking about using a lot of lead, and we're sometimes talking about dropping 24, 36 ounces of lead. Obviously, you need a rod that's going to be able to handle that. We generally like to see a longer rod, so something that's about 6.5 to 8 feet. The two rods I have in my hand are from Efficient Rods, which are folks right out as soon as you go into the show. They build a couple of rods that are really well suited for tiles. Some of you might know the Real Seat, the tackle shop in Brielle. They really put a lot of this tile fishing on the map, and they have a couple of custom 8'2" rods that are also, they're made to handle heavy weight, 16, 20, 24 ounces of weight. And keep in mind, you know, you're not just dropping 20 ounces to the bottom for nothing. The idea is you're going to come up with a couple of nice 15, 18 pound fish, hopefully. So you want something that's got some backbone. The rods that Efficient puts out are, they tend to build a lot with the sort of the acid wrap guides, which many of you either love or hate, which means the guides are actually, they sort of spiral around the blank. But you know, this is a nice, you want something that's got some sensitivity, but definitely, you know, you need something that's got some backbone to it. A couple of our favorite reels, if you're going to be manually cranking, again, I pro staff for Shimano, so you know, I use all their sort of latest and greatest stuff. But the Talica 2, which is something that it's a lever drag reel in the 16 or 20 size. It's going to have plenty of line capacity, and it's also, you know, lever drag reel. If you're like most people, if you're going to spend $500-600 on a reel potentially, you want to be able to have double duty with it. Okay, something like a Talica 16, a Talica 20 is also a great tuna fishing reel, tuna chunking reel. So it's something that would work very well for, you know, either of those applications. One of the beautiful reels that Shimano's come out with in recent years is the OSHA Jig. Well, they reintroduced it in the United States is the OSHA Jigger, and they originally came out with a 2,000 and a 4,000 size that's applicable to tile fishing. And they're star drag reels, and you know, so with bottom fishing, as many of you bottom fishing sharpies know already, you know, with bottom fishing, a lot of times you drop into the bottom, and you want the clutch on, clutch off kind of thing, and you don't really need a lever drag in a lot of instances bottom fishing. So the OSHA Jigger 2000 and 4000 are both great reels. Again, plenty of line capacity, plenty of drag pressure, but even if you were to ask me what is sort of at this point, the optimum best tile fishing reel, I would tell you this: it's the OSHA Jigger LD, which is the lever drag in the 2500 size, which is actually the only size that comes in at 2500 or 2501. You're welcome to pass this around if you want. But it's a lever drag reel. It's got plenty of line capacity. It fits nice in your hand. So it's a really nice reel. Feel free to pop that knot off and crank it if you want. And so you know, you'll see it's a beautiful reel, and it's a good size because with tile fishing, you're going to be holding your rod and reel most of the day, as is true in most bottom fishing. you don't want a huge clunker of a reel to wear you down. Okay, so that's one of our favorites in terms of a reel. If you are the kind that you want to go with an electric reel, Shimano currently puts out a Beastmaster. You might still be able to find some Force Masters, but certainly there's other companies out there who have different versions of electric reels. Some of the traditional electric reels have cables that come off of it. You have to connect it to like a car battery, which, I'm sure any of us who've ever picked up a full-fledged car battery, it's a real pain in the ass to drag around, 40, 60 pounds of lead acid battery. What we do a lot of times if we're fishing a reel with cables is we get jet ski batteries or motorcycle batteries, 12-volt ones that, and as long as you charge them, they usually hold plenty of charge for the whole day. There's nothing wrong with electric reel fishing. If you're out world record hunting or state record hunting, electrics are not acceptable with IGFA. So if you caught caught a big fish on an electric reel, it would not qualify as a record. But we carry a couple of electrics on our boat because from a charter point of view, I don't know if the guy that's chartering our boat is going to be sort of a hardcore Sharpie that's out looking for a record tile fish, or if it's a guy who just had a shoulder injury 6 months ago. And I don't want to prohibit that guy who had the shoulder injury from being able to fish for the day for tiles. So if they want to use an electric, it's a nice thing. Most of the line that we use is always going to be braid. Obviously, you all know braid is so much thinner and more sensitive than mono, so we're using braid. Despite the size of, especially Goldens, where they can be upwards of 50, 60 pounds, we usually, on our bait rods, our maximum, the heaviest braid we use is usually about 40 or 50 pounds. Because as you know, braid tends to break. 40, 50 pound braid, what's rated as 40, 50 pound braid, probably breaks at 60, 65 anyway. And the nice thing about bottom fishing for tiles is that you're really not fishing around rocks or structure. It's not like you're black fishing or sea bass fishing where, it's going to be rubbing up against things that break. Okay? And on top of the braid, we fill the reel up with braid, but the last little bit, it's going to be about 8 feet of 60-pound fluorocarbon that we tie with either a uni to uni knot or a yucatan knot. Those are both great knots that for fishing conventional gear where it's dropping up and down, it works real well. Okay. So in terms of our rigs, we're fishing sort of supercharged chicken rigs or high-low rigs, similar to what you'd use for sea bass, but on steroids, okay? Because we're fishing for bigger fish and it's deeper, but we're usually using 2 or 3 hook chicken rigs or high-low rigs. We're usually making them with 60-pound fluoro, which is tile fish do not have great vision, and because of the depths, it's unlikely they're going to see your leader. So you don't have to go crazy about using light line. In fact, stiffer 60-pound or up helps to keep the stiffness of it, because when you're dropping your bait, sometimes 400, 600 feet, that stiffness of your leader, that standoff leader, helps to keep from getting tangled up. Most of the hooks we're using are anywhere from 4.0 to 7.0. You can use circle hooks if you like. Some people like circle hooks because, as you know, with circle hooks, once they hook in the corner of the mouth, they tend to stay there. But my own personal preference, I use more of a J hook. In fact, the style J hook I use tends to be like the Gamakatsu octopus hook, which is like a shorter shank J hook with the eye sort of turned, upwards. But 4.0 to 7.0 is usually a good size range. Our hooks are tied on 12-foot drops or leads that come off of a 3-way swivel, which brings you to your main leader line. We always want to use nice ball bearing swivels on top because, again, the depth that we're fishing, we're bringing up potentially 2 3 tile fish from 400 feet, 500 feet down, your line's going to get tangled, your leader's going to get tangled, and having a ball bearing swivel is a worthwhile investment, because if not, your rigs just get cracked out after, you know, a few uses. We like to add little octopus skirts onto the right at where the hook is. Gives it a little bit more visibility, a little bit more profile, because again, in the depths that we're fishing, it's really dark down there. So
do you ever use glow skirts?
yeah, glow skirts are a wonderful thing. It adds a little bit to it. If not, some of the red and brown ones are nice, because keep in mind down there, tile fish are sort of opportunistic feeders, but a lot of what they like to eat are lobster and, you know, lobster-like things. So a lot of the red browns are also really good too. But the glow is a great option. Okay.
What about the flashing lights?
So some people use them. I mean, it's not going to hurt it. It does add to some attraction. You know, thing about flashing lights is, you know, starts to add maybe $15, $20 to your rig. You know, but certainly if you're serious about it. A lot of people do add little strobe lights, whether it's like the Linden Pitman lights and whatnot, or some other lights. You know, the one thing I would say about a cautionary note about using lights is that as you're dropping them, keep in mind they sometimes spiral in a weird way. So if you use lights, you might want to use some of the smaller little like strobe things, as opposed to like a big light, like, you remember like the old Siloom light sticks that we'd use for sword fishing. The concept is there, but just keep in mind as you're dropping it, that whatever it is tends to be imbalanced and it's going to twirl around your line. That would be the only cautionary note about using a light. Yeah, go ahead.
I think it makes them scope out further too faster.
That's true, especially if you use a bigger light, a Siloom stick, it's going to catch more profile and it's potentially going to make your whole thing scope out a little bit more. That's right. Yep. Any other questions on this so far? Okay. Most of the sinkers we're using are probably at a minimum 12, sometimes about 36 ounces. You know, usually banks. You know, banks are those rock cod type sinkers are good options. If we're bait fishing, some of our favorite baits are these. Keep in mind that tilefish, they eat what's in front of them. You know, it's not like you're chasing a school of stripers where stripers are feeding on bunker and all they're going to eat is, you know, I mean, you all have seen this, you know, if you got a school of bass stripers feeding on bunkers, you could throw eels to them until your, you know, cows come home. They're not going to eat the eel usually. They're keyed in on bunker. If you're striper fishing and they're all keyed in on rainfish and you throw them a live bunker, they're probably going to, you know, snub it because they're feeding on rainfish. Good news about tilefish is they tend to eat what's there, because I suppose if I lived 600 feet below the water surface in a canyon, I'd eat what's there too. But some of the more popular baits that we're using for hook baits are squid, whether it's a whole squid, just the head, or strips of it. And a lot of it depends on the size of the squid that you get. If you jump on a party boat, sometimes you have a little bit less control over what they're going to hand you. You know, we usually get a lot of those 4-pound boxes of squid. So by virtue of the fact that we're getting 4-pound boxes of squid, they tend to be smaller squid. If they're smaller ones, sometimes we use the whole thing. We just put the hook through the pointy end, so not the tentacle end, but the, you know, the pointy end, the triangle. If it's a bigger squid, a lot of times we detach the head, meaning the thing with the tentacles, and we fish just fish the head. You know, it's got the eyes and the tentacles, and that's what we're dropping down as a hook bait. And then some days, especially if you end up with larger squid, like the 8, 10, 12-inch squid, you might want to strip it out, you know, so sort of like how you'd use for fluke, sort of take the head off, open up the tube, and strip that out. Some other great baits, bluefish strips, okay? You know, many of you are fishing in areas where by May or early June, you're coming across like a lot of those racer bluefish and you're out catching them. I know a lot of people don't really like to eat bluefish, but they make great tilefish bait. So what we'll do is a lot of times we'll keep them whole, okay? We'll freeze them whole or keep them whole, and we fillet them, and we cut them into nice, 6 to 8 inch strips, similar to like a big fluke bait. We do salt them very heavily because, as many of you know already, bluefish tend to fall apart when they thaw or after you fillet it. So we salt them very heavy. Salmon strips, okay. On our boat, we're really lucky because 2 of our mates are also professional chefs who work in kitchens. So they have access to a lot of salmon fillets that get delivered with the salmon belly flap intact. So we're really lucky. We got a nice supply of salmon strips, tuna belly. Okay, many of you who also tuna fish, sometimes you don't know what to do with the belly flap. They make outstanding tilefish bait. I'm not going to say I'm going to advocate for this, but you could think of a careful way of doing this. A lot of times, because your tilefish and your tuna live in the same area, sometimes you're out tuna fishing and you add tile fishing into your day. You might have a couple of tuna in your box. Again, without violating any laws of cutting tuna, you might want to be able to strip out some parts of the tuna. They make absolutely great, tough tilefish bait. Mahi, if you're able to, get some of that. They're all great baits. One of the things, regardless of which of these you use, the thing that's really important is strip them. If you're using them as strips, put the hook in the fat end, the thicker end of the strip once or twice. Don't go crazy, like piling it on like you would don't try to string the whole bait onto the hook. Put the hook through once or twice, and that's it. Because the idea is you want it to flutter and look like a larger profile, okay? Okay, so, well, let's just go back. Any questions on the bait fishing side of tile fishing or anything like that? Pretty good? Okay. So let's get into talking about jigging for tiles. And again, I know 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, I don't think we would be talking about tilefish jigging because the equipment really was not there to be able to do tilefish jigging effectively or realistically because you are fishing so deep. One of the biggest advances we had, a few decades ago was braided line, okay? And braided line, because it's thinner, more sensitive, lets us use the thinner lines that can get to the bottom and therefore jig more effectively, okay? And some of the rods and reels and jigs that have been developed have been very effective to get us to be able to jig for tiles. Again, when from a charter owner operator point of view, I'm on the phone a lot with people who are booking trips, and they tell me they don't want to tile fish because it's very boring. They say to me it's there's nothing for me to do. I don't want to just drop a bait down and press a button on an electric reel and have it buzz it up. So I've taken that excuse out of their vocabulary because now we jig for them, okay? And as you know, jigging is more hands-on, one-on-one type of thing. You're actually doing something to entice that fish to bite. And when we talk about this kind of jigging, keeping in mind tilefish are living on the bottom. They're not living in the mid-water depths. They're not living 10, 20 feet off the bottom. They're living on the bottom. Many of you have heard about this slow pitch jigging and some of the equipment that's been developed for slow pitch jigging, which has been very popular, especially in the South and Florida and things like that for different kinds of grouper and things like that. But essentially, a lot of that slow pitch gear, rods, reels, jigs that were developed for slow pitch fishing have fit perfectly into what we want to do with tile fishing. Because with tilefish jigging, it's not like bluefish jigging where you're really squidding or rapidly reeling a jig through the water column. You're fishing that bottom 5 feet of the water column. And so a lot of the tilefish technology has been oriented to fishing that, okay? You recognize that guy? That's Dave DeGenero's son, Nick DeGenero. So some of our favorite gear in terms of rods and reels happens to be the rod. I know I passed this out to you before, but I sort of cheated. This is actually one of our favorite tilefish jigging rods. Came out a couple years ago through Shimano, and if I handed this to you 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you'd probably say, what do you use that for? Fluke, flounder, depending on where you are in the state, use it for sea bass. You probably wouldn't even think you could catch a striper on something like this. But again, rod development technology is just so advanced now that this rod I have in my hand, this Synosha Jigger Infinity motive rod in the heavy size, is actually rated, get this, it's rated for 6 to 16 ounces of weight. This is made to handle a pound of lead or a pound of jig. It's incredibly sensitive, and most importantly for jigging purposes, it's incredibly light. Okay, this is the rod I just handed, many of you handled this a few minutes ago. And this rod it's been an incredible go-to rod for tilefish jigging. Again, our favorite reel is this Osha Jigger LD 2500. It's a lever drag reel. It's available in medium gear or high gear. So there's always like unending controversy, friendly controversy, as to whether to use a high gear reel or like a regular medium gear reel. And I can't answer that for you. It's, to me, and again, I'm in the tackle industry, I say it's personal preference. If you talk to some of the folks at the Reel Seat, which is, again, it's an absolutely amazing tackle shop, and they do a lot of tile fishing, they will tell you go with high gear because you want to bring everything up quickly. Makes sense. If you asked me and my guys, I would tell you we like the medium gear because a lot of times you're going to be cranking up, hopefully, a pair of 15-pound tile fish along with a 16, 18-ounce jig. That's 20-some pounds that you're going to be cranking 400 feet, which doesn't have to be difficult, but we find that a medium gear reel is easier on your knuckles. So if you ask me, I would tell you go with a medium gear, but there are certainly other Sharpies out there who would tell you go with a high gear. At the end of the day, I think it's your personal preference. A lot of it is, how good is your cranking ability, When we spool these up for tile fishing, we are usually using 20 or 25-pound braid, okay? And again, it might sound crazy because some of these fish, are 25 pounds, but we know from experience, and from experience, that a 20-pound braid is going to break at around 30, 32, and this super thin line lets us drop easily 800-900 feet down. And you talk about the scoping issue, like when you use thicker lines, heavier high-profile rigs, it catches in the current and it tends to scope out. One of the things about tilefish jigging that I will encourage you is that it tends to be as up and down as you can make it, as opposed to letting it scope out. You don't want this, when you're jigging, you don't want your line like scoped out way over there. It still might be on the bottom, but it's way over there. We find the best tilefish jigging tends to be like as vertical, literally up and down as we can. So some of our favorite lines, if you are willing to spend the extra money, like the Power Pros Max Quattro tends to be a very, and especially thin line. So the Max Quattro 20 is probably one of the thinnest braids that's out there. We put a top shot on of usually 60-pound fluoro or 60 or 80-pound fluoro, about 8 feet long. Okay, and again, we're using a uni to uni or a Yucatan style knot to connect those two. Okay. When we jig for tiles, what we're using is we've got the jig on the bottom. We've got the jig on the bottom, and then we have about an 18 to 22-inch length of leader up to usually a 3-way swivel up here. And off your 3-way swivel, there's going to be about a 6 or an 8-inch shot of of mono, short mono, again 60 pound, which has a hook with usually a mini skirt of some sort, you know, a squid skirt, some type of small skirt. And we do tip our jigs and our teaser, that thing that's hanging up there, with bait, okay? It's not a sin to do it, okay? You know, people don't look at you funny just because you put bait on a jig. It's completely legit, and again, because we're fishing so deep, the smell of the bait adds to your jigging, you know, effectiveness, okay? So that's our typical jig setup, where your leader connects to the jig. A lot of times we use one of those, you know, there's different trade names for it, but like whether it's a snap swivel or one of those quick, what am I blanking on? One of those quick change clips and things like that. Because sometimes you're going to be changing the weight of your jig, okay? So when we tile fish, when we jig for tile fish, again, it's not like bluefish jigging. You know, when I say like bluefish jigging, what I'm picturing is you're casting an Ava 47 out, you're letting it drop down, and then you quick reel it back as quickly as you can. That's not the kind of jigging we're talking about with tile fishing. Instead, with tile fishing, it's vertical jigging and it's jigging right on the bottom. So when we do this, we get to our destination, folks line up at the rail, they drop down to the bottom, they hit bottom, engage the reel, okay? And we talk about what's called, because we have so much time on our hands, we come up with these stupid things. We call it a twitch to lift ratio, okay? A twitch is, and keep in mind, this is braid, so there's no stretch. When we used to fish with mono, we'd always have to account for stretch, especially when you have 400 or 600 feet of line out. But a twitch is something like this, okay? It's a quick lift about a foot of tip, because a foot of tip here is a foot of your jig moving down there. A lift, on the other hand, is more of like this, okay? You're arcing your rod maybe 6 or 8 feet, maybe even more, okay? So there's a difference between a twitch and a lift. When we are tile fishing, tell you what we do is, we usually do about 8 twitches, okay? And it's not that fast, you know, you space it out a little bit time-wise. But if you don't get bit after about 8 twitches, then we do a lift, and we drop it down. Because what happens when you do a lift and you drop it down, this just happens to be a sample jig in a package still. But, so you lift it up, say 6 or 8 feet, okay? What happens there?
Sound.
Exactly, okay? Again, keeping in mind tile fish don't see very well and there ain't a whole lot of light down there, okay? When you're doing that lift and drop, that sound attracts tile fish. And in fact, some of the Sharpies that fish with us for tile fish, they swear that if they don't get bit after their 8 twitches, after they do their 1 lift, they're on, okay? And you know, I wish I could tell you they're full of BS, but it's true. I can't tell you how many times, if you're twitching and you're not catching, do the lift, and then pretty much right after that, you're hooked up, okay? And again, the twitches are sort of like that. Because you're making a little bit of movement down there. Keeping in mind, a lot of times your tile fish are feeding on crustaceans like crabs, lobsters. Yeah, picture like what it might be like if you're 600 feet down and you're a tile fish and you got like a crab crawling along. You know, it's going to sound like something like, you know, something like that. And that's what your twitch is. But every once in a while, you're going to want to do that lift, just to, again, add a little bit extra action and sound to it. Okay? Make sense? Okay. Most of the jigs we're using are 12 to 24 ounces, again, because I'm going to say to you, most of the times we're going to be using like 20, at most 30-pound braid. It's really thin. I mean, you guys have just handled this. You know, it's like fine hair. okay? And it cuts through water really nice. So by using such light braid, we're able to avoid these 36-ounce jigs, 40-ounce jigs. Most of the times they're about 12 to 24 ounces, and they're very effective. You might have noticed in the picture this jig and this jig, and I apologize, I didn't grab any off the boat before I came down. But this jig is what's called a tile fish bomb. There'll be a better picture of it coming up, and it's without a doubt one of the best jigs that is available right now for tile fishing. Okay, and here's a better picture of it. It's put out by a company called Old Man's Tackle Box, which is a New Jersey-based company. You could find them at the Real Seat. They have a website and things like that. But the jig itself actually almost looks like it's got, as you can tell, it's got the shape of a baseball bat, but it's shrunk down to, about yay long. And they come in different sizes, 12, 14, 16, 22, 28 ounce, all these different weights. The general rule of thumb, I would say to you, is use as light of a jig as you can get away with. And what do I mean by that? If you're having a hard time hitting the bottom, if you're having a hard time staying on the bottom, you need a little bit more weight. But at the same time, don't go overly heavy and then have a jig that just like gets to the bottom and gets stuck in the mud, and then you're working extra hard, because believe it or not, if you're jigging, hundreds of times up and down, there's a difference between jigging a 28-ounce jig versus a 14-ounce jig. I can promise you that's going to feel a lot better for you if you're jigging a 14-ounce.
You make those hooks too, since you're on the.
Yes.
So these I think were factory things. And Jerry, who makes these, he likes J hooks.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, he likes circle hooks. And believe it or not, because I think many of us who use circle hooks, if you like circle hooks, the mentality has always been like, you don't have to set the hook.
Right.
They just hook themselves. But with tile fish, you could be jigging and lifting the rod, and the circle hooks still do a great job of hooking them. Color choices, certainly the tile fish bomb comes in some different colors. The pink and white, which is that one, is probably day in and day out the best choice, okay? It would be like if you're trolling for stripers and you use white shad or chartreuse shad, well, same kind of thinking. Day in and day out, our go-to would be the pink and white. The chartreuse and white is a good second option. I don't have a picture of it here, I don't think, but last year he introduced a lobster color, so it's sort of like a rust and brown color, orange color, and it's a really nice. We used that a lot this last season, and it was very, very effective color pattern. Okay, so this is the jig that we would use at the bottom, and then again above it, about 20 inches, is a teaser with a hook, a separate hook, and we would put bait on the jig hook, and we would put bait on your teaser hook. Okay, Shimano, as a company, they put out a jig. One of theirs is called the Shimmer Fall. It's a great jig. The sharp edges of the Shimmer Fall help it fall very quickly. I will tell you, in all fairness, the problem with a Shimmer Fall is that I think the biggest size is the 240-gram jig. I don't know if you guys and gals have the same thing that I do. I struggle going between grams and ounces.
No idea.
I know. So I'm going to make your life easier, okay? Because someone told me this, and I always, with all the seminars I do, one of my most favorite things is to be able to impart something useful. And I would tell you, 30 grams equals 1 ounce, okay? It's approximately. So 30 grams equals 1 ounce. So a 240-gram jig is about 8 ounces, okay? And it's a little on the light side. So, a couple of the jigs I have with me today, and I literally just stole them off the shelf from Blue Water Tackle, which is again right out front here. These, feel free to pass these around, and they're 410, 510-gram jigs. So a 400-gram jig is about 13, 14 ounces. some of the colors, you know, we again, we like the pink whites, the chartreuse whites, and if there's some, you know, something that resembles sort of a lobstery type of color. Okay.
Alan,
Yep. Go ahead.
I've also heard too, 1 foot for 1 gram. I'm sorry, what is it? Yeah, 1 foot for 1 gram. So,
Yeah, you know, it might work. Yeah,
so,
I mean,
so,
in terms
so,
of,
so 200 feet would be a 200 gram.
yeah, I think there might be a point where it's like, it's a little different though, if you add current in and stuff, but yeah, I could go with that. I won't argue with that, you know? Hey, a couple of tile fishing tips I'm gonna throw out there, because running a charter boat that tile fishes, you know, 40, 60 trips a season, easily, if not more. That's just my own trips as opposed to some of the other captains. Hey, steal that rod back there for a second, thanks.
Those are door prize.
I know you thought it was nice, but it is. When you drop your jigs or your bait, free fall, okay? You know, try to drop it as quickly as you can. I know a lot of times, you know, people try to put their thumb on it to prevent back, you know, bird's nests and stuff like that. I get it. Sometimes people put clickers on. Like, don't do it. Just free fall. Get it to the bottom as quickly as you can. If you're using rigs with multiple hooks, make sure you set it up so that the hooks aren't tangling each other. Keep in contact with your jigs and your bait when you get to the bottom. You got to feel it, okay? This is also going to be my #1 pet peeve about tile fishing, is don't snag your neighbor, okay? Whether you're on a party boat or a 6-person charter boat, don't snag your neighbor, because if you're fishing in, I want to just give you this visual. If you're fishing in 500 feet of water, all right, and dropping a bait 500 feet down, that's the equivalent of going 50 stories up on a building and dropping something down to the street, okay? Now picture, you and 5 of your friends just walked 50 stories up, and you're standing at the edge of the building dropping stuff down to the street. Please don't snag each other, because when the fishing's good, the last thing you want to do is be tangled up with the person next to you, right? It's a good way to lose friends or make enemies if you're on a head boat. So try to work together, whether it's dropping it down or when you're fighting your fish up. Try not to tangle your neighbor. When to set the hook. Tile fish are pretty aggressive fish, okay? Usually if you're jigging, you'll feel them jump on. It'll be like a good solid doot doot. Just lift up on it and you know, set them. Reeling them up. Because you are reeling up a fish that has a sinker attached to the rig, that's going to be 16, 20 ounces, or a jig that's 16, 20 ounces. There's a lot of down pressure. We tell people just crank, put the bend in the rod and just crank. If you have a rail that you want to put it on, put it against a rail, just crank. And again, that's why we like the medium gear reels as opposed to a high gear reel. We tell our people, don't do this, don't do the lift and pump, okay? You know, if you're a tuna fisherman, if you're a striper fisherman, and you hook up a nice fish, lift and pump makes sense because you want to gain line and then reel down on, lift, gain line, reel down on. Don't do that with tiles, because you got heavy weight that's putting a big hole in that tile fish's mouth if you keep doing the lift and pump. And then, you know, when you're about 60 feet from the surface, all of a sudden your tile fish falls off, and you look at me and you say, what happened? And I say, I told you not to lift and pump, you know? I don't want to see your fish float off any more than you do, okay? So if you're tile fishing, it's steady pressure coming up. Taking care of your catch. So these are absolutely delicious fish. Bleed them, ice them, use saltwater brine. Keep only what you want to use, okay? Aside from the fact that there are limits on what you can keep, you know, obviously be responsible with what you keep. And if you decide to do catch and release, remember most of the times you got to vent them. You know, put a little needle inside of them to release the air or pop the air bubble. And, okay. Any quick questions or anything like that? Any questions at all? Okay. So all right. You know, our boat's over at booth 205. If you have any other questions, you want to stop by, you know, BS or whatever, feel free to. If not, I'm going to collect up all my door prizes. They really weren't door prizes. Here's my other two.
I can't keep
Well, you know, it's a good try, but you know.
Keep it
Actually, I
for
put it
$30.
in my bag.
There you go. Well, for the tile fishing folks, thanks so much for being here. Okay, have a great season.
Thank you.